talking about the argument from design. Specifically, I'm arguing that molecular machines inside the cell show signs of having been designed by an intelligent mind. Now, last week I introduced the argument as summarized by Douglas Groothuis as follows. Premise 1. Molecular machines evidence specified complexity, i.e. they are contingent, complex, and specified. Premise 2. Specified complexity cannot be explained on the basis of chance or necessity, or the combination of chance and necessity. Premise 3. Intelligent agency is a known cause which produces specified complexity. Conclusion. Therefore, the best explanation of the origin of specified complexity in molecular machines is intelligent design. If you haven't watched the last 2 episodes, I'd strongly recommend going back and watching them. A lot of what we're going to talk about today will make a whole lot more sense if you do. So the most common objection to this version of the design argument is called the cooption theory. The basic idea behind the cooption theory is that even if the individual pieces of molecular machines don't serve a useful purpose in that particular machine, unless the whole machine is together, they could serve some useful purposes somewhere else, then get co-opted for use in the new machine. Now, back in episode 58, I gave Michael Behe's example of a mousetrap to illustrate the idea of irreducible complexity. A mousetrap is made up of a whole bunch of individual pieces, like the base, the spring, and the hammer. If you remove any one piece, you don't just have a less efficient mousetrap, you have a piece of junk. But the co-option theory suggests that the individual pieces of the mousetrap might still have some useful purposes outside the mousetrap, and then later on get co-opted for use in the mousetrap. The base, for example, might make a pretty useful paperweight. So before we look at the specific evidence, let's take a look at this objection logically. In order for this theory to be plausible, what does the skeptic need to show? They need 2 things. Number 1, they need to show that the various pieces of these molecular machines exist elsewhere in the cell. And number 2, they need to show some mechanism that could take these various pieces out of whatever machine they're currently operating in and move them over all at the same time to form a different one. Now first, let's answer the question of whether we see any of the elements of the bacterial flagellum, the irreducibly complex molecular machine we talked about last week, anywhere else. Yes, we do. The cellular pump is found elsewhere. Now, have biologists found other homes for all the pieces of the flagellum? No, and that's a problem for the skeptic, but for the sake of argument, let's just assume that they could. After all, I certainly agree that they can point to at least one. Does that in and of itself make the skeptic's case? No, there's still a pretty huge piece of the puzzle missing. If all of these pieces are serving perfectly useful purposes elsewhere, then how exactly is it that they're being co-opted to form a flagellum? Even if skeptics could come up with some mechanism that would move these pieces from one machine to another, that still isn't enough. Remember, all the pieces need to be put together at the same time in order for the flagellum to have any usefulness whatsoever. So whatever theory skeptics come up with for moving these pieces around, it has to do more than just move them. It has to move them all together, so we end up with a useful flagellum and not a useless collection of meaningless pieces. In other words, even if you could somehow get a block to switch from working as a paperweight to bring it over to the mousetrap, unless you also bring the spring, latch, hammer, and everything else at the same time, you still don't have a mousetrap. If all you can do is bring them over one piece at a time, you might as well not bring them over at all. So is there any known mechanism that could do this? In a word, no. Now, is it possible that somewhere down the line, biologists might be able to discover such a mechanism? Sure it is. Like I mentioned last week, the design argument uses abductive reasoning, meaning it arrives at an inference to the best explanation, just like forensic scientists do when they're trying to solve a crime. But that shows the problem with skeptics clinging to the co-option theory. Based upon what evidence we do know about, intelligence seems to be the best explanation for the data from molecular machines. The co-option theory, though, tries to lean on what we don't know. It invokes what is merely possible as opposed to what is reasonably credible. Mathematician William Dembski calculated the odds of a bacterial flagellum coming together through purely natural processes. In other words, he figured out how likely it was that even if all the pieces could be found elsewhere, they would all be co-opted and come together simultaneously to form a flagellum. He found that the odds of that happening fell below what is called the universal probability bound. In other words, the chances were so remote that for all intents and purposes, they were zero. So in the end, the co-option theory does not turn out to be a credible alternative. The overwhelming probabilities support the conclusion that molecular machines, those identified by Michael Behe, are in fact irreducibly complex, just like he claimed. There's one and only one type of causal agent that we know of that can produce an irreducibly complex machine, and that's intelligence. But molecular machines aren't the only evidence of design we see in the cell. There's also the matter of DNA. But that's what we'll talk about next week. See you then. God bless.